I'm Jazib Zahir. I'm presently serving as the director of the Lump Center for Entrepreneurship. Chances are you have some familiarity with the Center for Entrepreneurship. It probably existed in some form while you were here. For some of the earlier students and the earliest students, I guess not, but at least for the last 11 years, it's been around at LUMS in some form. And I think you'll all agree that a Center for Entrepreneurship has a very important role to play in a university. And the analogy I always give the management committee is, like in a university like Harvard, which provides some of the inspiration for LUMS, you've got all these disparate schools with their own administrations and some form of turf wars, but the incubator, the iLab, is built on the one Harvard concept. This is where everyone comes together. And that's kind of the vision behind the LUM Center for Entrepreneurship as well. It's a place for people to come together. It's not just the business school, just the engineering school. It's for everyone. It's to promote entrepreneurship, but it's also to promote generally skills that are useful for your career. So in that sense, it's always been a very important part of LUMS. On the one hand, it has that mission of identifying promising businesses, of scaling them up, getting faculty projects involved in entrepreneurship, getting students involved in entrepreneurship, making curriculum. But it actually does a lot more. We do a lot of general programming as well, in the sense that we have a lot of physical space at LUMS in the basement of the School of Engineering. So most of the events we hold are directly related to entrepreneurship in some way, whether LUMS affiliated or tangentially affiliated. But that space is also used for other educational purposes. We have a lot of physical space we give away on co-working space model similar to Daftar Khan. So for example, you have the Khan Academy Pakistan team sitting in our space. You have students who got incubated 5-10 years ago and now have much bigger companies and need 20-30 seats sitting in our space. So it is that kind of place where even people beyond incubation who need physical space for their startups come. We do different consulting projects. Some of the prominent ones at the moment include working specifically on femtech with SERP and the Gates Foundation, where we incubate ideas, particularly in that vertical, and provide them training. And these are multi-year projects. We have another project called SEGA, which is with Ignite, the government, and it's focusing on identifying promising startups in the video gaming and animation space. So we feel like in a lot of ways, the LUM Center for Entrepreneurship is kind of seen as the regional and local leader for entrepreneurship. And that's why we do end up collaborating with entrepreneurship centers around the country on mentoring, on making curriculums. And one thing I'd like to share with you that I'm sure all of you appreciate, but I particularly feel it now that I'm in a role where I have some impact on the university, that running a university is a very delicate process. All those decisions on where to put funding have to be very well thought out. And the Center for Entrepreneurship really squarely fits into our strategy of how do we take the impact of LUMS beyond the basics, beyond the classroom. What can we teach students? What can we encourage that allows the university to grow, that improves its financial resources, and that increases its impact beyond the immediate university? So why do I think it's so important for the alumni to be involved in the Center for Entrepreneurship? There are a couple of ways. Number one, in the Center for Entrepreneurship, people are always looking for certain kinds of expertise. I'll have someone who comes to talk to me about, I'm looking to expand to Dubai. What do I do? I have someone who comes to me and is like, I have this fintech product. I need to understand this legal aspect of it. What do I do? I'm looking to add someone to the company playing this role. Do I give him equity? Do I give him profit share? What do I do? These are the kind of questions that get thrown at me every day. And what I love is that the Center for Entrepreneurship should have an ecosystem of people willing to share their expertise. And that's a model that I've seen has successfully worked for innovation centers abroad, that you have these mentors and advisors from among the alumni who want to give back. So one thing I'm really looking to do is to build that network of people, who's an expert on fintech in New York, who's an expert on edtech in the Middle East. So we have that list of people who we can kind of direct people towards when they need very specific advice. The other thing is, and this is something the stakeholders at LUMS are really keen on, is how do we incubate more ideas that are actually of interest to the community? Because right now, we have the big companies, and I mean, even in the last few days, I've been approached by people working in organizations as diverse as Service Shoes and FBR. We have these ideas. How do we find a team to work on these things in an entrepreneurial model? And I tell them, well, as the center, we don't really immediately put in teams, but like Y Combinator, we can maintain a list of ideas of interest. And we can also push the things you want to work on to students in their final projects. Okay, students in their senior year at SSE or the business school or whatever can work on these entrepreneurial ideas you're pushing towards them. And if they show progress during their final project, then we can guide them. They can get incubated. You can make them your team. You can figure out equity models with them. So that's something that a lot of people like as an idea. It's not going to be easy to implement for different reasons, but that is one of the things I'm looking at the Center for Entrepreneurship. So long story short, there's a lot the alumni can do, whether as advisors, whether pushing projects our way, whether sharing your own entrepreneurial journey with our students. So we'd love for the alumni to be involved in that manner. But again, the Center for Entrepreneurship is just one way to get the alumni involved in a way that makes high impact. And to tell you a little more, particularly about LumsX, our online learning platform, I'm director as well, but Dr. Ehsan, whom I'm sure many of you recognize, is the faculty director. So he'll tell you about kind of the vision there. And I hope he also touches upon all the exciting work he does in AI that I'm sure you guys are curious about. So the floor is yours, Dr. Ehsan. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jazib. And hello, everyone. So my name is Asani Ubkazi, and I'll briefly sort of talk about LumsX before we give the mic to Hamza, who has been waiting very patiently. So LumsX basically is the online learning platform of LUMS, and its vision is to extend the excellence of LUMS education beyond its physical boundaries and really provide access to world-class education to all learners, both nationally and internationally. And, I mean, it aims to address the skills gap that exists in the country, which is hard for traditional educational models to actually address. And, as part of LumsX, we've already engaged over 5,000 learners across 54 cities in Pakistan and beyond. And one thing we're really proud of is the fact that 69% of our learners have been female and 36% have come from non-metropolitan areas. We're also excited to announce our new sort of cutting edge courses on AI and its real world applications and use cases that are highly contextualized for low and middle income economies in particular. And these are designed and offered by the LUMS faculty and practitioners. And so whether you are in Sakha, Sindh, or Haripur in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or Zob in Balochistan, whether you're looking to upskill yourself or completely reimagine your career, these courses around AI and more are going to be a gateway for your future learning. So stay tuned. So without further ado, I'll request Hamza to take it away from here.
Hey, just before Hamza starts, I'll just quickly introduce him as well. And just to add on what Dr. Ehsan mentioned, we'd love the alumni to be involved with LumsX as well, because the alumni are our source of cutting edge information. So there are opportunities to make courses with us. There are opportunities to guide us on what courses your organizations want. So please do reach out to us for those discussions, because we're also doing a lot of outreach for LumsX among the alumni. Now let's go ahead with Hamza. So I know I'm old because now all the people I want to bring in as guest speakers, all the exciting people are much younger than me. So Hamza, I know from all his exploits as my junior at HSN, and he's done some really exciting stuff, both the conventional tech stuff and the unconventional startup stuff. And I think there's no better person to tell us about AI. I mean, I can only talk theory, but he can tell you about exactly what he's done. So thank you so much for your time, Hamza, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shazad. Really excited to talk to people. Once again, I'm Hamza. I've been in the US for about 14 years. It's a good amount of time. I came here for college, then was at Meta, which used to be called Facebook, for 10 years. And then for the past 3 years was building a AI video startup called Chams, and then exited that to OpenAI. And as of a few months ago, I've been there at OpenAI. Generally, just wanted to share my journey, kind of what the lessons have been for me. I'm definitely the kind of person who learns a lot from making mistakes. So hopefully, a bunch of it is going to be about the mistakes I made, mostly focused on entrepreneurship. I was looking at background of people, pretty impressive things that people are doing. It seems like potentially one of the interests could be going down the entrepreneurship path. So giving a little bit of information of what like my personal experience was like, What are the things that you get to not learn as much about without actually doing it? So without further ado, let me just quickly share some quick things. Cool, awesome. I think you can still see me, Joseph, with some slides. Cool, awesome. So yeah, so let me quickly go through like maybe A to Z of what my journey has been like. Um, and hopefully you can answer some questions at the end based on how this resonates with people. So really quickly, what was the startup that we built? It was called Jams. We wanted it to be a ridiculously easy way to create videos of yourself. An example video just to share with you is basically, let's say if you want to talk to people, share anything that you want to say, instead of posting it on LinkedIn or X, you would just talk to your phone for 1 minute, and then our AI agent will go and figure out, hey, based on what you're talking about, maybe we should generate some B-rolls, maybe we should create a cut here, maybe we should bring in these kind of captions. Basically, if you're familiar with Plot Code or Codex or Cursor, basically you can think of it as that, but for video for content creators. And then on the social side, we wanted it to be basically a sort of like a video Twitter where people can connect and talk to each other and share their ideas over video instead of just text. Um, so just maybe going back from zero, some things that I kind of based on the mistakes I made and some of the good things I did and some of the learnings, if I can condense basically like all of my experience from my early career, building all the way to my experience at Jams. This kind of mostly about my time at Facebook, where I was engineer for around 10 years, and sort of like what are some lessons that I wish people had told me in the beginning. I think the main advice actually that I give to people early career is that like literally your main currency relative to your peers is that you can put in as much work as you want. So whenever I talk to people, sometimes they bring up that, hey, like I am just starting out my career. So what should I expect? I just generally tell them that maybe you should have zero expectation of any work-life balance, which is like pretty maybe a harsh thing to say, but I think what I have found is like so many things that I have been able to do, like now, like maybe like 10 plus years into my career. So I can like trace that back to some of the things that I invested in early on. So just the fact that I was able to put in 12-hour days at Facebook as an early engineer, I think like that mattered quite a bit for myself. So I think generally like my advice to people is like use that to your advantage. Generally like connect with people, build good relationships. The other one that I often sort of tell people to do early in the career is just follow amazing people. Like you will meet people who either get really good stuff done or they're very good at their craft, whatever it is. So just kind of following them, being close to them has actually been a pretty good thing for myself. In my case, my co-founder, who I consider to be an amazing product builder, is someone that I met at Facebook, and then I was in his team for 7 plus years, and then he was the sort of the person who pulled me to the startup that we have, and then through him that I was able to do a lot of the good stuff. So generally, like being on the lookout for people that you can have career-long partnership with has been pretty good. The last thing I would say, which actually matters quite a bit these days in with AI and software engineering as well, is generally sort of you should look at the first 10 years of your career as sort of like building depth in some area. For me, what maybe not fully consciously, but what ended up happening was I ended up building depth in building consumer products for content creators. That's something that I worked on at Meta for many, many years. And then you end up sort of being the person who knows potentially the most about it in any given crowd. Where that actually helps you is when it's time to go do a startup. Generally, you want to have some sort of unfair advantage that no one else has. That sort of like makes you stand out in that field. And it's very helpful if you've been doing the exact same thing for that many years, and then generally like compared to anybody else, you would have a lot more sort of like learnings and insights in that domain. That's really critical. The reason that is very important now in the AI world, in my opinion, is a lot of the skills that generally would be valuable in the software engineering realm. Some of the maybe the easier ones are now starting to be a little bit sort of like duplicative with what AI can do. So like coding in particular is something, like you hear people talk about like, oh, we're doing X% of coding with AI instead of people. Like generally, I see that to be quite true as well. But if you just happen to have the depth which can sort of like put AI to work, that actually really matters. So I will just briefly go over my startup career in this slide, but feel free to ask me any questions specifically about my time at Meta or even earlier in college. So maybe kicking things off on the entrepreneurship side, where I was after 10 years of being an engineer at Meta, generally was feeling that as somebody who generally likes to just build things, code, had a little bit of a stall in my career in terms of learning. Was actually a pretty senior engineer, but not quite clear where do you go from there. Typically, if you are some of these like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, like these big companies, the typical path that you have as someone, you become a manager, you become a VP, you start to kind of develop a big team. Not something I wanted to do. Like a good day that I can feel very happy about is where I'm just writing code, building something that at some point becomes a little bit of a sort of a ceiling to that. The other thing was that I just felt that there's a new wave of technologies on the horizon. When we were getting started, there was a little bit of Web3, not as much these days, and then definitely a lot of AI things starting to happen, which I think was actually like a pretty exciting time to challenge a lot of incumbents. I think the way I thought about it is typically doing a startup, one of the hardest things is to find product market fit in any given area. And every decade or so, I feel like you get some sort of wave where almost every idea is potentially a good idea. So like if you think about it in the 90s, there was the internet, which is like, hey, there's so many things that were non-digital. Now you can just challenge the incumbent by just making them digital. Then at some point there was a whole cloud wave, which is, oh, just from going from software that runs on your computer, now it can run on the internet. So now whoever was the king of the industry on the computer, now you can challenge them on the internet. Then there was a whole mobile wave, which is you can make things more mobile. So things like, Cream, Uber, grocery delivery, all of these people started sort of building applications on mobile instead of on desktop. And I actually see AI as that, which is to just pick an area, like there is going to be somebody new in that area who's going to be AI native, who's going to beat an existing startup who's not AI native. So I was generally just thinking about, hey, like I'm currently not super happy at my job. If I ever want to get into entrepreneurship, right now is a pretty good time to do it. So sort of like my decision tree was, should I stay or not? If I leave, should I go to another big company? Maybe not really. Should I join a startup or not? Or should I do a startup or not? I actually started by first considering whether I should join a startup. And then I would actually encourage people to sort of explore that path as well before you actually go and do it yourself. I interviewed for a few startups who were looking for engineers, sort of like learning from them on like what it would take. At the end of the day, sort of what got me and like over the hump of doing my own startup is I was talking to them, and then generally it felt like maybe if I have to put in that kind of effort into doing something myself, I should be doing working at a startup. I should just do it for something that I'm really excited about. The sort of the math on how much sort of energy that you put if you just any kind of employee at a startup relative to sort of like like how much excitement you have. I just thought I might as well just do my own startup. So decided to do my jump into startup building. Um, I think some of the things that I thought about that are, in retrospect, pretty good things to think about when you're doing a startup. I actually think that there's like a few different ways of doing a startup. There's like a higher risk reward path, lower risk reward path. I actually think that I was a little bit like, even though I was doing a startup, probably wasn't taking on a ton of risk. And then it was also because I was doing it later in my career. The first thing I thought about was definitely just chalk up the next 3, 4 years as I'm not going to make any income, which means that I should have savings already saved up with me, with my family for at least 3, 4 years. So even if it's a wash at the end of the day, I don't have to worry. And then obviously, depending on your situation, that may or may not be true, but at least like I waited until that was true for before I started to do a startup. Second one was personal stability. Sort of like in a medium time in my career where I actually have a strong family system. I had recently gotten married, which I actually think is like you would imagine that would like potentially hurt your amount of time in a startup. I actually thought it was pretty useful because the kind of support that you could have generally as an entrepreneur is like incredibly sort of like challenging times, incredibly lonely. So having like sort of like a partner in your life makes things quite a bit easier. And also, I was like, I didn't have kids. So, that obviously made things easier. So sort of like being in that middle point kind of was sort of like a good sweet spot for myself. I think the third non-negotiable thing for me was having a trusted co-founder. Generally, like, I actually think that the founding team is like almost equivalent to finding an actual partner to get married with. I feel like it's like once you actually like do that, it's like that severe. You end up potentially spending more time with them than your family even. So having 100% trust with them is almost a prerequisite. I almost sort of recommend people that if you don't have someone like that, like just maybe consider being a solo founder. It's like not worth it sort of going down that journey, in my opinion, with someone that you just like kind of like don't 100% just know that okay they have your back no matter what. Um, yeah, and then sort of having unfair advantage in that area is something I already talked about, which is that you should feel that hey, like this is not just that I'm just doing it for no reason. It's like something that you're very passionate about, and then you actually know about it way more than other people, and then you can avoid a lot of the mistakes. And the last thing that I did was, again, just talking about the lower risk path. I actually interviewed for a bunch of jobs right before I started a startup, just to make sure that hey, if this thing doesn't work out, can I actually land a job at the end of the day? Which to me, fortunately, was good. So I just thought that hey, like hey, 3, 4 years give this startup thing a shot. If it doesn't work out, I can go back to doing a job. So generally, sort of like these were like my checklist for like, okay, now is a good time to do a startup. I think obviously we talk a lot about startup. It seems fun, exciting. I think what I tell people is like also maybe they shouldn't get carried away. Like sometimes it's also okay not to do a startup. I generally think that there's so many good ways to have a meaningful sort of kind of career and impact. People, do a lot of good stuff. So definitely, I know at least like in my area, like I'm in Silicon Valley, California. Everybody says that oh, they just want to do a startup no matter what. So generally, I just ask them to be very considerate about why they want to do it. I think some of the reasons to do it end up actually not checking out too much. So people say that sometimes like the money is a reason to do it. And, we're fortunate to have had a good exit, but generally, if you do the math in terms of like, hey, what's the expected amount of personal gain that you can make across all the scenarios of a startup versus maybe doing a job. I don't think the math is always clearly clear that just because a lot of times startup don't work out. So not necessarily like so something to think about. I think the last one is also like people just think from an ego reason, maybe like being a founder is better. I think generally, I think what I have found is 99% of the time that you spend as a founder is just in the trenches. What people mean by that is that um, generally, all of this like thrill of raising money, talking to venture capital people, portraying yourself as a founder. I think at some point that really fades away, and then all that remains is like, you're just working every day, grinding on your sort of product. So I actually think that maybe both these money and ego reasons, they sound like true from the outside, but from like once you think about it, I think generally what has to be true is you are very, very passionate about your area, and then generally you want to spend, potentially like 9 a.m. to midnight just working on it every day. Um, so one of the things that people sort of also kind of have a misconception about is sometimes you see a startup, at the end, either at this exit or sort of like, generally, them from the time that they became very big. What you don't see is like a whole maze of like, the journey of getting there. And then I just shared a graphic that kind of people refer to, which is like, the various emotional roller coasters that you go through as you do a startup. Initially, you sort of have this high of like, oh, we are a startup now, we raise money, but then very quickly you get into this deep area of like, oh, actually the thing that we build is not working, people are not buying, and then it's like ups and downs. So we actually, in the course of 3 years, we went through 3 different pivots, which essentially means you are running 3 different companies from time to time. The first thing that we built was actually, we were trying to build communities. Think of it as Facebook groups, but totally open and something which lives outside of any given platform. So the idea was that people can actually have a group, and other people can pay to be in that group, and that's the way you as a group admin can monetize. So we did that for a year and a half, which is actually in retrospect a very long amount of time before pivoting, and that's probably my biggest lesson and mistake from doing a startup is sort of like getting married to your idea. So we had this idea that, we were working at Facebook, and we were like, hey, it would be pretty cool if you can do Facebook groups outside of Facebook and then sort of get all the benefits without having to be tied to Facebook. We build the product, spend maybe 6 months just writing code, not talking to customers as much, just hoping that, when we go out there, we will go big. What ended up happening was once we actually started selling the product, we realized that it's actually not something people are kind of lining up to try and test and pay for that much. Even then, we spent maybe a year after that point when we were getting early signal that this is not working out. But, sometimes when it's your baby, you're like, hey, like we have to figure out a way to make it work. So we kept kind of trying at it until finally kind of giving up and saying like, hey, maybe this part is not working. So then we switched to our idea number 2, which was basically a easy way for 2 people to record a podcast together. So the idea was let's say, if you're familiar with WhatsApp video calling on your phone, you can video call someone. There's an AI that will take the video of you two and end up creating podcast clips that you can share out. So this actually was working out a little bit better, but again, not something that a ton of people wanted to use. And then we went into Jams as our third pivot, which was basically a video agent, single person video, but it would help you make the video and then post it on our social platform. And then half a year of working on it, so some of the people who had invested in us and also were sort of people that we trusted, they were leaders at OpenAI, and they reached out and they were like, hey, you guys, we really like you as a team. Why don't you come join us over there and build products with us? So we ended up kind of going down that path and then exiting to them, and then we're building some stuff over here that I can't talk about, and will come out in the next few months, hopefully. I think generally I was, most of the things that I've learned in my life, like generally have been from, like I'm very much fond of, hey, let's just push myself into the deep end. Let's learn from the mistakes that I make. So would love to sort of like share the ones that I had over 3 years of doing the startup. The first one I already touched on, which was like generally killing ideas fast is actually a pretty big deal. The way I think about it in retrospect is it's actually almost less important to figure out what the idea is. It is way more important in the beginning to create a process through which you will iterate on ideas. I think what I mean by that is, like even before maybe executing and building a product, you should figure out that, hey, like if I had built a product, how can I, within, let's say, a few weeks, just validate it out? Whether that means that either you already have relationships with your customers or you have some sort of like network that will give you good feedback and so on. That's pretty important. We didn't have this sort of set up. I actually think that if we had sort of done it through this lens and invested in our idea building process, maybe whatever we did in 3 years, I can imagine it could have been compressed in maybe a year and a half. So I feel like we potentially lost a year and a half just because we had not gone about it this way. And the second one I would say is we sort of like went about some things very traditionally, which is, hey, we are doing a startup, let's just hire as many people as we can so we can build a lot of things. What we ended up realizing is generally in this stage, it's actually almost detrimental to have the wrong people. What you want out of everybody in your founding team is that they're actually committing to be a mini co-founder themselves, and then they can really sort of like be the expert in those domains. So we actually went from 2 people who were me and my co-founder to 8, and then we ended up kind of going back to just 4 people, and then the 2 other people were really people that we trusted that, hey, you can just give them any task and then they can kind of take care of it. This is especially important when you don't have product market fit, because as you're going through idea to idea, generally you want somebody who can kind of like really like deal with that level of ambiguity, versus having a team where you sort of kind of have to make sure that they have something to do every day, even when the idea is not working out. That sort of like becomes very tough. So I would say, like, generally what I recommend to people is that not until you get product market fit, if you're purely in the software area, like probably not more than 4 or 5 people at that stage. I think that works out pretty well. The last one is sort of like as a software engineer and coder, it's like a bitter lesson, which is that distribution is almost as big of a deal as sort of your product. And what I mean by distribution is what will make your product actually sell. Um, Generally, the I think as much as you would like to believe, just building a good product is not something that gives you distribution. You really have to invest in it. So you sort of have to both be, a software engineer, but a marketer and a salesperson. And then you have to sort of build that muscle, whether you like it or not. So that means that, every week you should be having sales, customers call. You need to be sort of building up your online presence. You need to be like networking, connecting with people. And then for people like for me, that was somewhat hard in the beginning. You have to build a muscle for it. As much as I would like to be on my computer, just coding every day. Like generally, this is an area that sort of helps quite a bit. Um, there were definitely like some things that we did right in retrospect that a lot of people don't end up doing. The first one was generally having an extreme financial discipline for the funds that we had raised. Um, we actually ended up, for the seed raise that we had done, towards the end, we actually only ended up using 1/3 of it overall. This was through, not trying to grow the team too much, just being very judicious about how much money that we spend. And I actually think that in retrospect, I feel like we might actually be getting to a point, especially with AI and so on, that you don't have to really depend a lot on a fundraise. I actually think that outside of salaries for the 4 or so people, including ourselves, I think even if we hadn't done a fundraise, we could have probably done this as well, just through, just a small amount of usage of infra and then, service providers and so on. The second one was generally being founder led. You have to be ready to be the best coder, marketer, designer on your team. At the early stage, you really can't delegate out functions to other people. So you can't just hire your way out of what is very important for your company. And then lastly, generally building your network. sometimes people say that it's hard to get, the first few customers. I actually think your first 100 customers for sure should be your friends and your network. It might take you like, many, many months to get there, but like generally, even if you're like sort of like convincing two people every week that their friend, your network, to try out your product, you can at least get to 100 within a year. Um, and yeah, the last thing I would say is, we talk a lot about AI. I think being in an AI company, having done an AI startup, sort of what do I see as sort of the AI wave? I actually think that the main thing that people have rightly kind of talked about is, I think generally the software engineering industry is totally rocked right now. Like, even people in my sort of level of experience, like what is it like? I'm a software engineer at OpenAI right now. What is my day-to-day job is very different than what it was last year at my startup, which is very different than how it was at Meta. um, Towards the end in our startup and also at OpenAI, I most like 90+% of code is written with AI. That has implications on what kind of people we have to hire, implications on what kind of products we build. So generally, that's something that I think is a very dynamic space. I don't know. I would just say like the main thing you can do is like keeping up with all of the sort of the software engineering tools around AI, which keep changing month to month, is almost like critical area. Um, I think the final point I would say is generally within AI, one thing which has been very different is there's an expectation of a much faster revenue growth in startups. There used to be some sort of benchmarks within startups in Silicon Valley around, hey, you're a startup, you should make this much revenue by this time. I think because of AI, that has become almost 2x, 3x of before. Just because people, that users, their appetite to pay for AI products is much higher than their appetite has been to pay for other software products. And that has trickled all the way down to, like if you're an investor, like if you're just seeing a regular startup compared to a successful AI startup, you're just seeing them make a lot more revenue. So generally the expectation around like, hey, if obviously you could go down like a path where you delay the revenue because you're a social product or so on. But if you are like a B2B SaaS product, generally the expectation that you make revenue very quickly has gone up quite a bit. And yeah, I think so generally some very, very fast sort of quick 360 on my sort of experience, but mostly would love to sort of also, if we have time, take a few questions based on, what resonates, anything that people might want to ask.
Thank you so much, Hamza. I think there was really a very personal touch there on both of your story and especially what you've been telling us about how AI has actually tangibly changed things. We have a few questions here. I'll just direct them to you. So Ali Yasser is asking, Hamza, which part of the product caused the most friction during early user adoption and how did you solve it?
Awesome. That's a great question. I think, yeah, I think the biggest thing for us, let me just talk about it from the perspective of the last thing that we were building, which was the AI video agent. Um, I think the biggest thing that was a little bit of a friction point for people was kind of solving for the mass customer base, but in an AI native way. Um, for example, we sort of started by having the product be a sort of like a chat experience, for example. So if you're familiar with ChatGPT or if you do coding tools, essentially you're just like chatting to some product and then that product is doing things for you. This obviously, if you're in the AI industry, this is a very familiar experience. But what we were trying to do was build for the masses. So people who are not very AI native would still get it, and that was a little bit of a challenge. And then like we had to spend a lot of time educating people, which is, hey, previously you would sort of click on buttons to get things done. Now, if you want to chat with an AI to get things done, what does it mean? Sometimes you don't get what you want. Then what do you do? How do you kind of so basically that area was something that we had to iterate on quite a bit. We even sort of tried, towards the end, we said that, hey, instead of maybe an AI chat experience, maybe we should do a little bit of a hybrid of chat as well as a sort of like a regular, like you click buttons to kind of get what you're done. So this is probably relevant if you're building an AI native tool as well. I think generally like chat-based tools, people are starting to use them quite a bit in the professional tooling world. But like, if you want my mom to use my product, I think that's probably like she might struggle with it a little bit compared to just clicking buttons and so on.
Yahya is asking, hi Hamza, can you see non-tech people add value? You obviously have a tech background, and most startups have people with tech backgrounds.
That's a great question. I actually think that generally you can add a ton of value if you are someone who is really deep in that domain. So me and my co-founder were both technical people, and that worked out for us. I actually think that doesn't have to be the case. I actually think you can get incredibly good success, and I see that with my friends who are doing startups and other peers where you can really have a one technical person and then one non-technical founder, or somewhere in the founding team is sort of non-technical. Um, a typical example of that is someone who is really, really good at finding customers, both through marketing as well as sales. They're very good at understanding those customers. So generally, like more of a sales and marketing and an industry domain experience. That's very useful. I actually think that it might actually be the more typical path, that if you have one technical co-founder and one non-technical co-founder, generally you would want to complement each other's skills quite a bit. And this kind of goes to what I was saying, where just having a good product doesn't always translate into having the most successful outcome. Sometimes, actually, what I can imagine happening is if you have the right people in the room who can kind of, because they're very deep at getting distribution, marketing, generally being in touch with the user's mind, they can actually get you into that process that I was talking about, where you can iterate on products very quickly, and then maybe you can start to do the technical stuff as well. So I would say like that actually does work out pretty well. What I would say is that you generally want to still be an area expert and have depth. So let's say just pick something and then be the best in your network at it, whether that is you're the best marketer, or you're the best UX researcher, you're the best designer. Generally, like you want to be someone that your other co-founder doesn't even have to worry about. I think if you are not there, then what you can have a little bit of kind of duplication of work between the founders, where maybe one of them is okay at it, the other person is also okay at it, then not clear who can sort of really drive it home. But like, if you can be someone that the rest of the team can just rely on, like, okay, this person got it in this area, that can actually work out pretty well. So thinking about like my team, we had one person who was non-technical out of the four, and they took care of a whole host of things, and then really appreciated having them there. Hopefully that makes sense.
Oh, sorry, I got knocked off for a bit. So Hamza, I had a question, because the most interesting thing to me was when you mentioned how much of the code is being written by AI and how that completely changes the way we hire people and train people. So I was very curious about that. Last time I was in Silicon Valley was just a few months ago, I think October. And I asked some of the friends I met, okay, what percent of your code are you writing with AI? And I think they said like 40%. And then I asked the people sitting around me at the Lump Center for Entrepreneurship, who are obviously coding a lot as well, okay, what percentage do you write with AI? And I told them, this is the number. Silicon Valley, the Pakistanis gave me 40%. And so they agreed, okay, 40% with AI, but only 40% of that 40% we're finding useful. And the part that's not useful is actually creating a lot of problems for us. And then when I reflected on it, I don't have the same exposure as either side. My impression was maybe when people in Pakistan are trying to use AI for coding, they don't have access to the best tools, and maybe they don't have the same exposure to use it in the best way. Do you think that's the reason, or is there more to it?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I actually think that, that 40% in October sounds almost, yeah, I would say like that's my experience as well. I have had to update my sort of lay of understanding of the landscape almost every month. So I almost the way things are moving so quickly, like if you are understanding in October, like it's probably outdated already by Jan. So that's like definitely something that I'm seeing quite a bit. I think generally, in AI coding, I think what has been the case is if you use it well, you can actually get a lot more value. But as good as the tools have gotten, knowing how to use them well and when to use them and when not to use them, I think that has lagged a little bit. And sometimes, that sort of like general community knowledge gets shared. Sometimes, like in my own experience, around 2 years ago, I actually used to actively encourage my team not to use AI because they would use it and then it wouldn't do the right thing, and then obviously the models were not as good. But then, after having tried it, learning how it's working well or not, I ended up becoming a pretty big fan, and then I asked all of my team to do it. That being said, my own journey for first making mistakes around how to use AI coding and then learning how to do it probably lasted a good amount of a year. So like it almost seems like, like if I feel like at some point, there should be like a course in college on like how to do white coding, right? Generally, like I feel like something like that. So I think it's like you need to unlearn a few things and then you need to relearn a few things, and then that takes some time. The problem is, I feel like it's not a very clear structured path to learning how to do it. So then not everybody ends up kind of getting there. I think I'm hoping that as more and more people kind of figure it out, sort of like that can translate to sort of them sharing with other people. So I think people also in my network talk about like, hey, I'm not finding it valuable. I think when I sit down with them and then I share with them my workflow, like then I debug their workflow, I have yet to find a case where they don't end up, it doesn't end up clicking for them at the end. So I actually am no longer a believer of, hey, it's not valuable for myself. I actually think that, once you kind of do the right things, like you do end up finding value. It's just that you need to kind of figure out kind of how to do it, that kind of stuff. So I actually consider it like mostly sort of a relearning how to do the job problem, and then not everybody has gotten there.
Awesome. That's a lot of food for thought for myself and Dr. Ehsan in particular, I think, because we've been thinking about what do we need to train people on, and we've been thinking about like, we need a formal course on this and get it codified in some way. So Rizwan is asking, what are the big tech companies in the US focusing on for the next 5 to 8 years? Which products in the AI domain?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I mean, obviously, this, I can give you like what my view is, knowing some of the companies that I know, and then sort of obviously may not be representative of the entire game. I think two trends that I see in companies is one is, so generally, some of the very, very basic thing of like, hey, let's just let users do something with AI. I think that has been well covered already. The one of the trends that's happening now, which is more successful, is more verticalized AI solutions. So think of it as an AI agent who is your lawyer, an AI agent who operates in the medical field, an AI agent who helps you with your construction permits, right? An AI agent who can do your accounting and so on. So a lot of new companies have found, at least in Silicon Valley, kind of, or a lot of success recently in that domain because it really combines sort of the power of AI in a way that other companies, like my company that I work at, OpenAI, is never going to become the company that does construction permits, right? Like that's not a thing that they would ever compete in. So generally, like that area is like being in a business vertical of that type is something that's been very successful, kind of a playbook. And it also helps you because let's say if you're an expert in a given area, right? Like you know how to do accounting software, you're going to be much better at it than other people. So basically, like more verticalized AI companies is something that's happening a lot. The other on the tech side that's happening is generally, if you look at all the AI companies, there's a whole flow of you train a model, then you test the model, then you have to deploy it on some GPUs, then you have to find people to poke holes at that model and so on. So there's a lot of companies who are basically building for AI companies who have these needs. So either you are AI company who helps you optimize your model to run on a cheaper GPU, or you are a company who helps AI companies evaluate your models, or you're an AI company who helps other AI companies find security bugs in their AI products and so on. So now we're starting to see, this is a sign of a mature industry as well, right? Which is when you have startups working for startups as customers as well. So that's also starting to happen, which is companies whose customers are other AI companies as well. So those are two things that are coming up. It's a great question.
So Hamza, thank you so much for sharing your fantastic journey. One question I had was that, when you started working on your second idea, which was Jams, so I was curious that how did you navigate the sort of the emotional ups and downs during that phase? How many times did you think maybe, I might want to let it go and such like, I mean, all the emotional sort of, ups and downs you go through. So just was curious if possible to share your personal experience, because I think many of the early startup founders go through that journey, when to persevere versus to, pivot or let go and such like. So you mentioned about killing early. Of course, that has, a decision challenge associated with it because you're working with partial information sometimes. Just curious about your thought process.
Yeah, for sure. I think I am definitely like, I feel like almost none of the stuff I did in that domain was probably good and something to follow. I probably made all the mistakes first. And I agree with you that it's like definitely very emotional to kind of kill your baby and keep doing it again and again. Um, I think maybe the main thing that helped us was I think generally when you sort of like talk to customers, I think they usually give you a good idea of what they really want. And at some point that we realized was, hey, we're actually doing things mostly for ourselves because we like to build it. The kind of things that I would worry about is like, because I come from engineering background, which like is my code clean, or like is the architecture is good or not? And then I would talk to a customer and they're like, this, none of this matters, right? They're like, hey, I can't find this button on the screen. Doesn't matter how your code is. I don't want to pay for this product and so on. So I think generally, kind of going through this kind of journey of hey, like my main strength is engineering and coding, but none of that is critical right now because we're working on the wrong idea. Like I could end up building the best product which will not sell. I remember I was talking to my co-founder before we kind of killed one of our ideas, and literally 1 week before we realized it was really bad, I was talking to him, which is like, hey, I think people are going to line up. This is going to sell like hotcakes. We're going to blow up on the internet. And then next week, I was like, after a lot of sleepless nights, I'm like, why did we even spend any time on it? This is like the worst idea ever, right? So I feel like maybe just after you go through it a few times, you end up sort of kind of learning the better lesson for sure. I think maybe, I think at some point you get hardened a little bit, I would say, like a very big part of being entrepreneur is like just you learn to take no for an answer, and at some point sort of you just find, in a job, you're like, hey, like generally people are like, you're doing good stuff, like there's a little bit of affirmation. I think 99% of the time as a entrepreneur, if you're in a meeting, you walk out sad. So that you just learn from it. Like, you try to recruit someone, they end up saying no because like, hey, why would I join your startup which is not successful? You talk to a customer and they're like, why would I use your product? So I feel like you build a thick skin at some point, which kind of really helps. I think as long as you're able to kind of keep up with it. For me, the whole point about like having a good supportive family, I fail in 3 different ways during the day, but at least I come home and I'm happy with my wife. For me, was very helpful. At least can go to bed a little bit happy. A great question though.
how do acquisitions really happen? Is it that you need to know the right people? Is it a very long process? Do you get some indication that, this is an acquisition target? I think we're all curious about that because very few of us have ever got that far along, but we'd like to know a little bit more about kind of what that process is like.
Yeah, I think generally, obviously, there's a few different flavors of acquisition, and generally, like depending on the scale of the company, kind of how that happens. At our stage, generally, what most people are looking for is whether this team is someone that can really add a lot of value. Because you're in an early stage. If you're in an early stage, obviously, there's like a lot of like later stage acquisitions as well. I consider myself ourselves to be the early stage. Typically, obviously, any given company, they can themselves, like especially if we talk about like OpenAI, like they can replicate anything us as four people would have built very easily. So what is most attractive to them is this is a team which has a proven experience of working together. So they can then continue to, you know, even though they're at this stage, they can continue to kind of hockey stick and then increase within the new company quite a bit. So that kind of exit in our case happened largely due to the network. So you know the, um, the people who currently lead the product building part of OpenAI were people that we had worked with at Meta. They were also investors in our company. So just through them, and then it could happen for various reasons. For us, it was mostly an idea, which was we were very much ready to continue working on our startup, but then sort of like they seeded this idea, which is that hey, there's some opportunity to do a similar kind of thing within this bigger company as well. Why don't you consider it? And then it was definitely not an easy, obvious answer for us. We really kind of like thought about hey, what are the pros? What are the cons? Should we keep doing it or not? And then realize that, even if we kind of like look at it from the perspective of like, what do we want to achieve over the next 10 years, maybe it makes sense. So I think for such a small kind of area, I think having someone in your network who is a leader of a big company, knows and vouches for you as a product builder, like that sort of kind of is necessary. I know a lot of people who have sort of like actually explored and then tried to talk to people proactively. In our case, they had actually like seeded it themselves to begin the conversation. And once the process actually starts, I think it's probably not super complicated. I think, generally they want to sort of talk to the team, make sure that every single member of your team, not just the founding team, generally they want to make sure that you have built a good product, looking at your product and so on. So I would actually say that the process largely outside of the paperwork and accounting is some sort of like a company-wide interview process. So like instead, like you go through a job interview, this is sort of like the company going through a job interview. And then, that largely feels like that.
Fantastic. Hamza, I have a question regarding fundraising. So you mentioned about raising seed funding, and then you said, we could have, and you spent like 1/3 or less amount. And you mentioned that, you could have also done without that round. And I was just curious, what factors did you consider to actually, raise funds versus continuing, with the co-founder pool, etc. So just curious on that front.
Yeah, I think I think in retrospect, we just raised just because. I feel like I don't think so. I think maybe there's like definitely some of the things that we did that were more, I would say, just following the playbook kind of things. And I think that's like a tendency that people have in the startup world as well. You just follow the playbook. Sometimes you don't look at your individual needs. So even like, before we had even built our first product, we actually went out and started looking for investors. Most of the investors that invested at that point, they did it because they knew me and also my co-founder through the work that we had done at Facebook. And then generally, they're like, hey, these people did good stuff at Facebook. Probably we'll be able to do it outside, hence maybe give them some money to do it. I think if we I think I would say maybe the biggest benefit that we got from the fundraise, besides obviously the money to pay the people, was just the network. Like every investor that you have in your network is going to bring more investors, more customers. They have other companies that they can connect you with who could be your customers, or they're influential in your domain. They can also help you hire. Sometimes a lot of people that we hired, they actually, we were a small startup, so why would you ever discover us? They discovered that investor and were like, hey, I would love to work for one of your companies, and then they got routed to us. So I think this general, just having them in your network was very valuable. Most of the money that we ended up spending, because we were a software company, was just in the salaries of people. And then we had initially raised enough so that even if we have to hire a team of 20 people, that's fine. But then that's kind of where, like, realize, I think a lot of it has to do with AI as well. Like generally we were more productive with AI, and then generally we were like, hey, let's just go back to 4 people until we can figure it out. And then that just means that, most of the money is just going towards the salaries of those people, obviously out of which is just the founders themselves as well. So, you can even just kind of factor that out and so on. So I think that was just like minimal amount. A lot of the, in the software world, just from getting free startup credits from a lot of I was definitely like very stingy in terms of the startup credits. I used to figure out how to maximize them, make sure, like, choose the service which gives you the most credits and so on. So our actual non-people cost was almost minimal throughout this entire time, which I think, if you're okay not taking a salary, I would actually say that you totally don't need to raise until you find product market fit.
Hamza, one thing I've been thinking about a few years ago, online learning was really just kind of a fad. It was cool, but
Mhm.
the completion rate was low, engagement was low. Right now, what Dr. Ehsan and I are focusing on at LumsX is really out of this belief that, online learning is here to stay and everybody benefits from it. So we're curious about what are the norms you're seeing from your vantage point in Silicon Valley? Is it a common thing? Is it a common thing among certain segments? Is it still seen as a fad? How do people look at online learning now?
Yeah, I think people are definitely trying to rethink a lot of things. I think I'm a little bit, I feel like, further out in my career. So most people interact with, I think they're done with the learning that they want to learn, and generally now it's like more on the job learning. So a lot of my kind of, I have like a lot more secondhand work and less firsthand kind of context here. I think generally, I do think that online learning in a targeted way, even for myself, has recently been very valuable. Sort of like before we, for example, were doing AI startups, we explored briefly a little bit of a Web3 angle to our social product as well. And for that, I had done an online sort of course around building secure Web3 apps, which was sort of like a 3 to 6 month actually a 3 month sort of online learning course, which even for me was very valuable just because of how targeted it was. So they had assembled basically the foremost experts in Web3 security to basically give you hands-on, actually practical experience, which was very helpful. I actually think that I would expect the sort of the space in software to become a lot more dynamic, where sort of, in the past, your typical, I will go through college, now I have the skills for the next 2 decades. I feel like that seems a little bit less applicable now versus, hey, every year you have to learn something new is a little bit more applicable. And obviously, there's some people who learn more on the job, but then there's some people who benefit from having a more structured experience. So I actually think having so one good thing about online education, which I actually think will kind of make a comeback potentially, is if there's a more targeted thing, which is like, if there was ever a course on how to do white coding well, I can guarantee you a bunch of people sign up for that, at least from Silicon Valley, right? So like similarly, like if there's one on like, if there was a course on like, oh, how do you because there's also a question of like, how did you market your product? I don't think I did particularly well. So if there was one, I would have attended that course. So, generally like things like that, which like, oh, how do you sort of I think like even something as simple as like people in Silicon Valley these days were wondering like, oh, how do you make a good launch video for your product? That's also something that, at some point people will be interested in and so on. So yeah, I think a big fan of, and I think a lot of people in my network are a big fan of these like targeted kind of ways of learning. And I think, there's obviously some people who like to learn in a more class setting. And for those, it would be very helpful, I think.
I think, Ehsan, we're have to going to go after Hamza to make the vibe coding course. We found the right person for it. But anyway, we'll pursue that later. Yasser was asking about what platforms did you use to market the product and make it more presentable to the customer? So if you'd like to add anything there.
Yeah, I think generally, I don't think we crack marketing necessarily that well. What we did the best, I would say, is sort of like directly one-on-one reaching the customer, and then we tried a lot of different ways to go about it. I think we generally, like, I would say, innovated a lot more on find out where the customers and then find some angle to be in their inbox in a way that they would find us appealing. So, for example, one of the things that we would do is we would take a video that you had already posted and then we would run it through our tool and then make it an AI video and then we would send it to them and then they would find that impressive. Like, oh, I didn't know that you could do this kind of stuff, right? So so yeah, so we kind of focused a lot more on that kind of strategy. I would say like if there's somebody else who is much better at the more broad marketing, I would love to learn from them because I don't think we necessarily sort of crack that.
You're really at the center of everything AI, but what is happening in quantum? I mean, it seems like a very science fiction sort of thing, but at the same time, if you follow it, it seems like it's gone practical. It might bring some big changes. What are you seeing?
Good question. I don't think I would necessarily have the best sort of kind of um, yeah, I think I wouldn't have the best visibility of that. I still think that quantum is just from the nature of kind of how deep it is in like cutting edge research. I still think that it's very much a few companies who are sort of at the forefront of it. It doesn't feel, at least being in Silicon Valley, that it is imminently impactful to the industry. I definitely think that when something big happens over there, it could be like very big ramifications in terms of compute. Like there's some people working on sort of like AI native, sorry, quantum native kind of AI inference and so on. Um, that being said, I think almost none of the decisions I feel like people are making right now are sort of assuming that is imminent. So I personally would still feel that it could be at least a few years out until a regular person who has never heard about it has to probably catch up on it. At least that feels to me like from being here. Obviously, it's a pretty exciting area. I think if you want to spend, if you're deciding what to spend time on as a PhD researcher, spend the next 10 years or so, like this could be an exciting area. But like at least Jazim, from a like a software engineer perspective, like it just feels like it's not in the air yet, at least in Silicon Valley.
So Hamza, one question I had was about, you talked about reasons for starting startup, and you mentioned it's not a great idea to do it for money or ego or just for your passion. So I was just curious that what were your sort of inner motivations for doing this? Was it purpose, with larger purpose you had in mind, or I mean, if you could shed light on that.
Yeah, I think, and I feel like at this point, the good thing is that I can also talk also about which one of the motivations end up being true or not as well. Um, I think the biggest for me was sort of like a day-to-day level purpose in the sense that, hey, I would like to wake up and then be excited about what I'm building. Obviously, one of the risks that you take when you do a startup is that the thing you're building, nobody wants that thing. So you have to be okay with that. But I feel like even, now that I'm back to being essentially an employee of another company, there's a little bit of a regression, even though it's a very exciting company, which is that, I am not deciding and fully owning what I'm working on every day. And I think that part is very exciting. And then I was totally missing that at a company like Facebook, just because it's very mature. You don't get to do that every day. I would love to spend a lot of time, building something new, coding, engineering, so on. That's something that you end up, like, it's not 100% of your job at some point, right? At a startup, 100% of what you do is basically what you want to do. So I think that to me was a very big part of the motivation. I think the other thing that was very helpful, I actually didn't think it would be a big deal, and that's something I would enjoy a lot, but in retrospect, it was generally being close to the cutting edge of a lot of technologies. I think if you do a job, I think maybe 50% of the things that you're learning are obviously cutting edge, but I would say 50% are just how that company does it. So when I was at Meta, I was sort of learning how Meta does certain things, how do they do their database, how do they do their servers, and so on. I think probably, if I had just applied for another company from Meta, I would actually not be a great hire just because I just know how to do things at Meta. Versus at a startup, especially being a CTO, I think almost every open source technology I have like tried a little at least once. So I actually think that really helped me quite a bit. I actually feel like I'm closer to the industry having gone through their experience, because now if I talk to someone and they were like, hey, like I'm doing this, like what database technology should I use? I feel like, I can guide them a lot more right now after doing the startup than when I was at Meta, because at some point it just becomes like, hey, do I want to spend 30 years here? If not, I'm actually probably not learning anything. And then it's better to learn kind of from outside. And in startup, this happens to be like kind of like a fast way of like learning something, just because you have the ability to like any other company, you wouldn't be able to say that, oh, instead of this database, let's try this database, right? Like that wouldn't make sense at a big company. Like at a startup, you can do it within 2 days. So you end up like learning very fast. So I would say like generally those things, which is like, hey, I was just wanting day to day motivation, that every minute that I'm spending on my computer, I'm enjoying and feeling like I'm closer to the cutting edge of, whatever software technologies can exist.
Fantastic. Thank you, Hamza. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we have exhausted the questions from our group, but this is so awesome. I think we really went beyond the basic stuff and really got your personal perspective on lots of things to people who are really interested in the space. And we really appreciate you getting up so early. We know you started at your 5 a.m. and it's still, I guess, just about sunrise time, as it looks from the background as well, if that's the real one. So really appreciate you kind of putting in that effort for us. So thank you so much, Hamza. We'll kind of finish the formal session here. And of course, some people have maybe already reached out to you or might reach out to you with some follow-ups they have. And of course, our goal is really just to build this community and connect the Pakistanis abroad and the Pakistanis here to think about ways they can work together and learn from each other. So really appreciate it. Really appreciate everyone joining us, and really looking forward for everyone working together on entrepreneurship and online learning. Thank you so much, everyone.